Welcome, everybody, to Lunchtime BABLing. My name is Shea Brown, the CEO of BABL AI, a company that audits algorithms for bias, disparate impact, ethical risk, and effective governance. So I'm very pleased to have a good friend and colleague, Ryan Carrier. Ryan is the Executive Director of ForHumanity. I don't know what your title in ForHumanity University is, main professor or lead instructor or whatever.
Can I be chancellor? Does that work?
That's excellent. Yeah, chancellor is good. And so Ryan is a font of wisdom for everything algorithmic auditing, AI governance, risk assessment. And so Ryan, why don't you introduce yourself more formally, and then we can start chatting about what has been a very busy couple of weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. So as many know, but maybe not everybody, ForHumanity is a nonprofit public charity founded in 2016, and our focus is on examining and analyzing downside risk and engaging in risk mitigations for AI, algorithmic, and autonomous systems. And the primary source of those risk mitigations is to establish an ecosystem, establish an infrastructure of trust called independent audit of AI systems. And so we do that because we think we'll get the best possible benefit from all of these tools by mitigating these risks for humanity. And that's where the title and the name comes from. We are an open organization. Everyone is welcome to join. We are almost 1,300 people now from 79 different countries. And when we produce this infrastructure of trust, we are trying to enable all auditors, all pre-audit service providers, governments, regulators, accreditation bodies to engage in this ecosystem of independent audit of AI systems. And so that's the primary work that we do. And there isn't anybody out there we're not trying to help with this system, or who should, who can't benefit from the system. And that includes the corporations that engage in these audits, because we think it provides a more robust governance oversight and accountability for their interaction, development, provision of AAA systems.
Thank you, Ryan. So this is a big mission, and there's a lot happening in this area, as you know, I've talked a lot about on this podcast. But let's focus first on Europe, because you just came back from a sort of grand tour of Europe. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you were doing there? What are the kind of activities going on, and what do you see as things that people should be keeping an eye out on?
Sure. I'm just going to go in chronological order because it was a bit of a whirlwind tour. So landed in Amsterdam and spent time immediately with the financial regulator and the Dutch Central Bank to talk about Digital Markets Act and the impact of AAA systems on financial markets. This is important because the Netherlands is a little unique in Europe because the government has had huge problems. In fact, the government turned over because of problems related to AI and algorithmic systems. And so, unlike a lot of other jurisdictions, the government itself and its own usage of these tools is quite keen to improve governance, oversight, and accountability. And so that was the beginning of these discussions. We also met with the largest bank in the Netherlands, ABN AMRO, and these were pretty sizable meetings, large attendance, sort of 30, 40 people. And then finally, we met with sort of the AI hub of Amsterdam and people who are building startups, innovating in the space, and how to essentially build compliance by design into their ecosystem. That was Amsterdam. That was one day. I didn't even stay there for a night. Immediately raced over to Berlin and met with, or was hosted by the Berlin AI campus. Again, a similar kind of incubator, a place where you could go for innovation and developing. And the primary talk there was independent audit and how we build this ecosystem, but also how we address key issues of small and medium enterprises, where a lot of this innovation is coming from, and how we can build compliance by design in a leveraged fashion, in a centralized fashion that small and medium enterprises can plug into. And I think that's very applicable back here in the United States, where there's concern that maybe we aren't, that this regulation, this oversight, that independent audit might stifle innovation. We have no interest in that. And so trying to enable good governance, but even for small entities, is a role and a task. We then went on and met with the EU Commission on the Digital Services Act. Why this is important to babble and babbling in this podcast and people who are listening is that the Digital Services Act, like New York City, it requires independent audit of compliance, and it requires independent audit soon, sooner than most people will be ready. Shea and I actually got to participate in a virtual workshop about these needs. And interestingly, the Big Four were there. The Big Four expressed, here are our needs to be able to engage in these audits. And right now, the ecosystem can't supply those needs. That's where ForHumanity hopes to step into the breach, into this gap and hole. We have offered to the Commission to provide a full set of audit criteria for them to approve by April 1st on the Digital Services Act. Why? If we can give it to them by April 1st, then we can go back and forth and let them make sure the criteria reflects what they want, not what ForHumanity wants. We have ideas, we have suggestions, but really we want the Commission to feel empowered to say, this is what we meant by the law in terms of audit criteria. So we want time to go back and forth so that by the fall, by September 1, we can begin to teach people about and how to execute this audit criteria, train them as ForHumanity certified auditors. In addition to that, we then worked with CENELAC, JTC 21, on the EU AI Act. We are a named technical liaison to that body to provide support in how conformity assessments are developed on the EU AI Act. And that was a very fruitful and sort of forward-looking meeting. And then finally, we met with the ICO and a few other government officials in London to talk about how we build and enable this infrastructure of trust, which is already plugged into our submissions on GDPR and the Children's Code, which are not mandated audits, but given the large amount of risk around compliance with GDPR and the Children's Code, the demand for affirmed or assured compliance with those laws is really strong on the corporate side, because failure to do it results in huge fines. Is that a sufficient summary?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. So let's dive a little bit into this idea of audit. I mean, you mentioned criteria, and some people that are listening may not know what that means. And there are lots of different ways to think about how you audit, and people use different terms. One conception is, you hire somebody that literally comes into your company and does a lot of work, risk assessments and testing and that sort of thing. That's a common way people talk about audit. But you're talking about now something that requires some strict set of criteria. And so, could you explain a little bit about sort of the ForHumanity philosophy on what you're talking about when you talk about these audits?
Yeah, absolutely. The former, the first part of what you said, we reject any notion of use of the term audit. Okay. Anytime an entity enters an organization and works directly with that organization, provides a feedback loop, it is not an audit. That would be a misnomer. You're using the term incorrectly. Okay. So we make that distinction because audit is precious. Audit is the fourth line of defense in a 4-line of defense model. The first 3 lines of defense, people, designers, and developers, that's level 1. Level 2 is management oversight with expertise, so algorithmic risk committees, ethics committees. The 3rd line of defense is still internal to the company, an internal audit, which is by definition not independent, or an oversight of risk management. This is the 3rd line of defense. The reason the 4th line of defense, true, independent, external audit. For the first time in this line of defense model, we have an unincentivized entity who will assure compliance with laws, guidelines, best practices, and standards, okay? All of those things are not written to be auditable, especially when we get to this fourth line of defense. With this fourth line of defense, an auditor not only has to be independent, and we use Sarbanes-Oxley as our definition of independence, no upside potential for the auditor by engaging with the auditee, and they engage in a tense format. That tense format is the same sort of tension that you have as a teacher with your students, right? The students don't walk into class for that final exam and you put your arm around them and you're like, don't worry about this, Jim. When we get to the tough parts, I'll walk you through it. It's not the point of a test. The point of a test is, do you have the knowledge? It's a tension test, right? When we talk about an audit, it is also a tension. And that tension shifts to say, have you complied with society's rules or laws, okay? So it's this tension. In this tension, when we add the word independence, we now say you can get no other remunerations from your auditee except your audit fees. So I have no upside potential of working with this client beyond the audit. I can't provide advice, guidance, strategy, remediation, software, platforms, hardware, nothing. Why? Because true independence means the removal of any potential conflicts of interest. And so if I'm worried about losing my revenue streams associated with those other activities, I might not be objective when I adjudicate, have you complied with these rules? So independence means no upside potential, but it also means another key and critical thing, downside risk of false assurance of compliance. Here's how this works. Shea, you're my client. I'm your auditor. I've been your auditor for years. You and I are great friends. All of our audits go perfectly, and when we're done, we get dinner afterwards. So I walk in now, Shea, what's going on? You're like, Ryan, we got a new system. Let's audit it. Fantastic. We'll start. Have you built the algorithmic risk committee? And you smile and you say, yeah, Susie, Sally, Jimmy, Joe, Bob, they're all on the committee with me. And I smile right back. I've met all those people. I know them all. I know you're telling me the truth. But as your auditor, I have to behave differently. I have to say, you know, you have to prove it to me. You have to show me the meeting minutes. You have to show me the roster. You have to show me how the algorithmic risk committee impacted the system. Why? Because I don't work for you. I work for the public to assess that you have complied with these rules. And here's the key and critical thing that makes this infrastructure of trust work. If I tell the world that you've complied with these rules and you have not, who gets in trouble? Is it you as the auditee, or is it me as the auditor? And the answer is, it's me first. False assurance of compliance. So in this equation, no upside potential and the risk of false assurance of compliance. This represents true independence. And when an independent auditor then says they have complied with all the rules in this equation, now the world will believe compliance must be true. And that's how we establish this infrastructure of trust and the great benefit and value of true third-party, external, independent auditors acting as a fourth line of defense.
And so what's so important about the criteria then? You know, what role does, you know, some might say, why don't I just look at the DSA and I'll come in and I'll audit you for the DSA? Why does there need to be this criteria? What's special about it?
So it's not ForHumanity even saying this. We saw this in the virtual workshop. The Big Four, who've been doing audits for 50 years under an independent third-party set of rules. Society wants to have auditors who are not using their own rules. When we talk about the great value of audit, it's because an audit here means the same thing as an audit here and the same thing as an audit here. We want a uniformity of rules that are not controlled by the auditors. And quite honestly, the auditors don't want to set the rules because it creates a conflict of interest. And so what we need as a society is to take these laws, guidelines, best practices, and standards, none of which are written to be auditable. None of those things, the great difference between standards, IEEE, ISO, et cetera, they write generic framework level standards, or they write very specific technical specifications. What they don't do is write auditable criteria. And auditable criteria means one thing: binariness. If I'm that auditor who is at risk for false assurance of compliance, I need to be able to adjudicate compliant or not compliant, and there can't be gray. Auditors don't do gray. Why? Because they're at risk, right? If I'm looking at your compliance, if I'm your auditor again, I'm looking at your compliance and I know Shea wants to be compliant. I know he's followed the guidance, but I don't think everything's here. If I have any doubt that you are compliant, what do I have to say as a truly independent auditor who's at risk? I have to say non-compliant because I can't prove it, okay? And so this audit criteria has to take the law, guidelines, best practices, and standards and craft it into auditable rules. This is an art, not a science. And that's why the role that ForHumanity aims to play is to establish this truly auditable criteria, but we do it without claiming authority, and we aren't seeking authority. What we do is we establish these audit rules and we take it back to governments and regulators and say, is this what you meant? Will you approve this description of your laws for people to follow and have assured compliance? So to get back to the specific point, you have to get to this level of auditable criteria to have at-risk third-party independent auditors be willing to say they've complied with all the rules because they have enough proof and evidence to be able to back it up.
Thank you. So let me ask you a question. This is something that I'm curious about in the sense that I haven't wrapped my brain around how this is going to work. But for the EU AI Act, and I have a feeling I haven't wrapped my brain around it because a lot of people, they haven't decided it yet. But for the AI Act, for high risk systems, so for those who don't know, the EU is passing this whole digital this whole package of legislation. Digital Services Act is one, and the EU AI Act is another component of that. For high-risk AI systems, they will require, in some cases, or it seems like they're going to require conformity assessments. So if we're talking about AI audit, what is the distinction between a conformity assessment and this sort of auditing that we're talking about here?
Conformity assessment, so the words are important, okay? Conformity, one conforms to standards, okay? As I mentioned already, standards are not compliant or non-compliant. They are framework. So conforming to a set of standards is not assurance. There is not certainty. There is no one who would step onto the other side of that equation and said, I can prove to you that they've done what they've done, okay? That's why AI audit, certification, and against an independent third-party set of schemes or scheme is one step more robust than a conformity assessment. A conformity assessment, and they're still talking about this, it might be a self-assessment. It might be done internally. There might be performance reports to show how they've conformed to some standards, but again, without certainty, without assurance, without that fourth line of defense of an independent valuation. Or they might require independent independent conformity assessments, which is a step better, right? Self-assessment, one of the things we talk about with independent audit of AI systems is humans often want to do the right thing. Humans often want to comply with the rules until they get busy, until they get distracted, until other things come up, until change happens and they didn't pay attention or see it, okay? The problem with self-assessment is that we are an inherently lazy species. We've proven this over hundreds of years with the way we teach. We conduct tests. We ask people to prove their knowledge. And it's because we behave differently when we know someone else is watching, when we know someone else will come and check our work. We no longer will be lazy. We will no longer slip up on change management. Why? Because that independent third party who's at risk is going to say, it's not done. No certification, right? And so that changes the equation. It creates that tension that's so valuable, that builds the infrastructure of trust better than a simple conformity assessment. So in Europe, we have this tension right now. The EU AI Act calls for conformity assessments. That's all the law says. Whereas the Digital Services Act demands third-party independent audit. I would argue that this journey that the EU is going on only ends in one place. Eventually, when the ecosystem is large enough and robust enough, it will be mandatory independent audits for all AI, algorithmic, and autonomous systems that impact humans in a meaningful way. And so eventually this will all be built into the system, and thus we will go or move to compliance by design approaches, where we're building the ability to satisfy these audits at the very beginning of our development of these tools. Did that answer your question, Shea?
Yeah. So I think that the short answer is they're still deciding on it. So conformity assessments are not audit. They're not independent necessarily, and they're not binary. And it's up in the air whether independent audit will become a feature or a requirement under the EU AI Act.
I don't think it will when it's passed. I do believe the law will be passed this spring with implementation in 2025. And I don't think they have the ability to take the step they've done with the DSA. Look, the DSA requiring independent audits is brave. It's going to be a challenge to meet the needs. The ecosystem is still young. I think the work that's being done in this ecosystem is amazing and it's great value to humans, but we have to admit that this is young. Okay, and so we have a maturity process. I can give you an example of this early development. ForHumanity is training and accrediting ForHumanity certified auditors, people who are proving their knowledge and expertise based on certain audit criteria like GDPR, Children's Code, New York City bias audit. We only have about 50 people who have passed that accreditation. Do you know how many we need to do this work in the future? Literally hundreds of thousands. So that maturity cycle is going to happen. I predict we'll have 500 FHCAs, ForHumanity certified auditors, by the end of the year. But you can see where that growth rate has to happen. And so from the EU's perspective, for them to come in and mandate independent audits on the EU AI Act, which is hugely impactful, would be very difficult. I see this as a maturity cycle of how these tools are regulated over the coming 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, so that leads us to another issue, which is some of that maturation is happening in the US now, because the US, there's been a lot of activity around and a lot of conversation around independent audit, some more mature than others. So New York City is now requiring what seems like, unless the rules change, independent audits for bias, for automated employment decision tools. DC is considering doing something very similar. Laws in Colorado, California. There are guidelines being issued and potential rulemaking at the EEOC, at the FTC, where independent audit is being explicitly considered and mentioned. So, what are your thoughts on what's happening in the US and Yeah, I'll leave it very broad. Like there's a lot been going on. So where are we so far? Like what's the ecosystem looking like? How are these regulations going to play out in your mind? How would you like them to play out? And just any of your thoughts on this?
So we strongly believe that in this fourth line of defense, independent third-party auditors provide an enormous mitigation of risk to humans, the end users, the impacted from all of these systems. I would tell you, and it sings in my soul, that this is right, and that this is a righteous approach to these tools and the nature of their enormous impact to persons. I'm not going to try to tell you that this should happen today. So if I were asked to testify in Congress, independent audit of all AI systems, I would be the first to bang the table and say, and you can't do it tomorrow. And you can't even require it by the end of this year. We have to be able to grow into this because the ecosystem is just not ready. Now, are we ready to conduct independent audits on the New York City AEDT bias law? Absolutely. We have a set of audit criteria that's already in place. We need regulators and lawmakers to recognize that these tools are available to them that can create an accreditation system for not only the individuals who conduct these audits, holding them to a high standard of a code of ethics and professional conduct, but also begin to accredit entities as qualified to deliver these independent audits. We have them in place today. We have a good number of groups and entities that could meet the requirements of what a certified auditor looks like. We have the ability to conduct a full-scale set of independent audits on what is known as New York City AEDT bias audit law, local law number 144. An argument or suggestion that we don't have sufficient expertise in place is erroneous. We are growing and training all of those people today, and we already have in place all of the ability to meet that demand. Market supply demand will be met, okay? Now, as it expands to do EEOC level, to do Colorado, to do California, to do anything new at the federal level, the ecosystem will have to grow. And that's just going to mean more people, more training, more sets of audit criteria, and a process to establish this infrastructure of trust that involves governments, involves regulators, involves nonprofits like ForHumanity. When we look at the 50+ year track record of financial audit, there's nonprofits stuck in the middle of that, right? There's the Financial Accounting Standards Board. There's AICPA accrediting individual CPAs. So the ecosystem is known to us as to how we go from here, where we are today, to where we can be in 2, 3, 5 years, recognizing that it will grow, recognizing that it will mature, but also letting entities play the key roles that they're going to play. And so all of that ecosystem is present. We just currently aren't all sort of marching in the same direction. Did that answer your question, Shea?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's a lot of questions in there. Like I think we're seeing a lot of arguments about maturity of the lack of maturity of the ecosystem being equated with, therefore, let's just not do independent audit. And I mean, one thing that I feel like is, by the way, if you have questions, we already have one question in the Q&A, but if you have questions for us, please put them in there. We can address them shortly. I think that in my mind, it feels like there's been regulatory assurance. So forget like our little ecosystem that we're building, which I think is really important. And there's a lot of critical things missing with the current sort of assurance ecosystem that exists with all of these firms that are currently doing regulatory assurance. So there are things that are missing. However, there is an ecosystem out there that is equipped to, let's say, verify statements that are made by organizations and to produce reasonable assurance that those statements are indeed true. And so it feels like that is like that's being lost on a lot of these arguments. And what we're pushing for, the maturing of the ecosystem that we are pushing for is on top of what's already been built and is there. But what's been built and is already there is capable of doing at least some level of this assurance for almost any kind of procedure or verifiable statements that a company could make. Like, what are you? Does that sound right to you, or there are things that I'm missing?
No, I don't think you're missing anything in this context. The arguments that are being made are purely monetary and human capital pain arguments. I don't want to do it is essentially behind all of the arguments that are against. Now, if those entities, and we'll focus on AEDTs for the moment, if those entities are saying, we did a search and we can't find someone who could provide an independent audit on our AEDT, they're lying. Full stop, they're lying. There are enough entities that are out there who can provide these services within a 12-month period of time. Now, remember, the law has been in place for 16 months now, roughly 15 months. And so part of what they're doing is they're saying, well, we didn't start 15 months ago, we're starting now, and people are busy, right? And auditors can't schedule me in, or it's going to take time and I can't get it done by April. Well, that's no excuse. It really is not an excuse. The law has been in place for quite some time. Now, rulemaking is happening. They might say, I didn't know what I should have done. Those are a little bit more legitimate because they're still going through the process of identifying how to do this. Therefore, extensions of time on the law may make a lot of sense. Not our call, not our care, to be honest, because the approach that we take is if you're going to self-assess these tools, it is insufficient, full stop, because you already had the chance to do all that, and yet these tools still exhibit an enormous amount of bias in data, in architectural inputs, and in outcomes. So you've already failed your chance, and this is true of much of Silicon Valley and much of the technology. You've had years and years and years to put in place robust governance, oversight, and accountability, and it has not been done. Now the law will require it, and society should demand that there's independent verification of those governance systems. And as you said, a lot of that doesn't take technical expertise. Much of what's included in a bias audit, both from ForHumanity and under the law, is not requiring technical expertise. It's requiring robust procedures and processes to assess bias. Why? Because you can't eliminate bias, you can only mitigate it. Show us the steps that have been taken. Abide by the law or the rules, and then document how you've done that for your independent auditor and receive verification that you have good processes in place. Will it eliminate bias? Impossible. Not even a goal, right? Will it begin to mitigate bias by introducing robust procedures and controls into the process? Absolutely, it will. So arguments against this are primarily cost, and I'm not going to try and tell you there's no cost associated with it. However, cost is about building capacity. And once that capacity is in place, it's going to be leverageable in other marketplaces. And here's the key thing. You might not like the New York City bias audit. Everything covered by the New York City bias audit has to be done under the EU AI Act. Annex 3, number 4, A and B, covers all AAA systems, AI, algorithmic autonomous systems that engage in employment or employee benefits or their work status. Therefore, you're going to have to comply with a much larger set of compliance items if you operate in that jurisdiction, if you impact EU citizens. And so beginning to build that capacity now, stop fighting. Stop fighting this plan and this process. Independent third-party oversight is coming. Build the capacity now, and then you'll have a great benefit to be able to meet the demands of other jurisdictions in the future. Sorry, I rambled. I hope that wasn't too much of a rant.
No, that was perfect. No, it's music to my ears. I think I say this a lot when I talk to potential clients or clients, and we've even seen it with actual clients, that it's painful. It's a painful process. It's not meant to be painful, but it's meant to be rigorous. But in the end, you are on a path which you're going to need to have been on anyway, and it's better to start. And I think there's a potential to sort of differentiate yourself by sort of taking these steps early. Yeah, so absolutely. So let's take a look at some comments here. So the first one goes back to the idea of conformity assessment, and they are saying essentially, isn't a conformity assessment procedure based on an assessment by independent notified body? Isn't that pretty much synonymous with an independent audit? That's the question.
And this is still being debated and settled. There's amendments around this. It could be a notified body. It could be a full certified body. It can be trained and required through the Act who's going to do it. But the difference remains that conformity assessment is not the level of audit certification. They are not providing the same level of certainty. Shea, you and I wrote this in our paper on taxonomy a couple of years ago. There's a level of audit certification that is above and beyond assurance. Assurance can be provided on conformity, on standards, where there's basically a gray that says, we know what the standard is. We can't perfectly verify. We can't 100% stand up and say, we have absolute proof of conformity. We can say, we believe that they've conformed. It's a level weaker than audit certification. And then finally, it is possible that some of these conformity assessments might be allowed to be conducted by the entity itself. Here's a set of criteria. Here, we've done it. I'll submit the report to you, the government. So this is still being debated. I have a strong preference for where it goes. I don't think self-assessment is ever sufficient.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think this is it remains to be seen. And I've heard some criticisms of the conformity assessment paradigm, where they basically center around a sort of quality management system, which makes a lot of sense. I think ForHumanity requires that as well. But it's a document assessment exercise, which doesn't necessarily map back onto what the company's actually doing.
And actually, let me add on to this. Conformity assessments are often conducted once. You're conforming, or you've been assessed to be ISO 9001 compliant. Those reassessments are often done years later, if at all. And so the question, or the big difference that remains between a conformity assessment and a true independent audit is a true independent audit is going to be conducted annually. Much of that compliance may not change, so the cost gets reduced over time. But the other key thing is that AI, algorithmic, and autonomous systems learn and grow and change. And so any sort of conformity assessment will be insufficient in terms of monitoring, post-market monitoring, model health and fitness, to ensure that all of those procedures are in place, including adverse incident reporting systems that help you to maintain and keep current your risk management system, maximize your controls, mitigations, and risk treatments.
Great, thank you. So let's move on to another one. So this is about the California Privacy Protection Authority, looking for public comments. So essentially, the question is, that parts of that are talking about automated decision systems. They're looking for comments. Is ForHumanity gonna step up and make any comments there?
So the last public hearing for California Privacy Protection Board was in late December. ForHumanity was the only group that testified at that hearing. Our testimony at that hearing was a request that the board should be prepared or think about or consider how it might accept certification schemes, audit schemes, because we are preparing to submit both a CCPA and an age-appropriate design code certification scheme to California. And we'd love for them to have a mechanism to consider how that might be implemented, because it doesn't today. So that was our testimony. We will also provide guidance on both the CCPA, CRPA, which is the new amendments, and regulations, rulemaking that they're in the process of, and the age-appropriate design code. We will be providing comments for all of that.
Good. So what let me ask you sort of a pie in the sky question here. Like, what do you see if you're looking in the next couple of years? Where do you see this ecosystem going? Like, what are the significant kind of like landmark moments that you see happening? And what do you think kind of has to align in order to get this ecosystem really off the ground and being sort of heading in the direction of what the financial auditing, for instance, or even cybersecurity auditing is currently?
So let's make a comparison to what happened with financial audit 50 years ago. The world of accountancy was about to break. One group would go out and they'd conduct an audit and they'd say, here are the rules. And another group would come along and say, but if you abided by my rules, I can lower your taxes. I can lower your cost of goods sold. I can basically make things better for you. And it creates this race to the bottom. And the industry saw it very quickly. They created the Wheat Commission, which then turned into the Financial Accounting Standards Board. And they basically said, here are the rules, generally accepted accounting principles. So that started the industry on a level playing field, which is great. But we still had to build around that level playing field. CPAs had to be trained on GAAP, right? But even then, the force of generally accepted accounting principles wasn't there. You didn't want to do it, you didn't do it, and nobody could say otherwise. It wasn't until the happy accident of the SEC came along and said, if you, and you have to remember, in 1975, this is a world that was just becoming, just starting to trade stocks at the mom and pop level. Okay, you could trade stocks for years, but you were JP Morgan, you were an institutional entity previously, and buyer beware was fine. Okay, but now at a mom and pop level, the SEC basically said, we need to protect them. We need to level this playing field and assure that the discussion about these companies in terms of their numbers is done consistently. They mandated publicly traded companies had to abide by GAAP and thus 10Qs and 10Ks. In London, about 6 months later, they did the same thing. And this spread like regulatory wildfire around the world. Within 2 or 3 years, every jurisdiction was mandating standardized audits, 10Qs and 10Ks. That created this world and this accountancy that we see today, dominated by the big four, $55 billion industry 2 years ago. So where or how do we get there? Well, eventually we need to see government mandated audits. We see it at New York City, but we see a huge fight against it. We see it happening with the Digital Services Act, okay? Jurisdictions will begin to change and start to mandate these audits. They'll focus on high risk first, and then they'll start to grow into most AAA systems that impact humans will eventually have to undergo these audits. We do believe that mandate will happen. We believe it's 3-5 years out before large areas are mandated, but the Digital Services Act is a big mandate over big companies demanding big compliance, and it starts in 2024. So we're starting to walk along this journey, but it's going to be a journey. It's going to take time. It's going to be a process. And look, it's always the same fight. This regulation is going to stifle industry. You hear it, regulation is going to stifle industry. It's the same argument. It's not. Regulation is a system of embedded compliance that enables your ability to meet the demands of some questions. It doesn't stifle innovation. It might slow it down. It might make it a little more expensive. But over time, you'll build this capacity and you'll change the nature of what compliance looks like. Those first 20 years of financial audit, when auditors would walk in, everybody reacted the same way. It was, the auditors, it's going to be a painful period of time. Well, eventually COSO came along and built internal audit, compliance by design, and now we just pump compliance at auditors, and it's not painful anymore. Nobody freaks out when the auditors walk in. We will get there with this, and we will get there much faster.
Yeah. So if I'm listening to this, so I'm already, of course, I'm in this industry and I'm really trying to push it. But if I'm listening to this and thinking, wow, this might be a great place for me to get into it, you know, what are the steps? What would you recommend for a person who, I mean, there's been thousands and thousands of people laid off in the past few weeks from big tech. They have technical skills. They might have interest in this sort of thing. How do you start? Where do you go?
Super great question. ForHumanity has some resources. I'm going to come back to those in a second. You need at least some general background in some of the multidisciplinary areas. So we identify 5 areas of risk: ethics, bias, privacy, trust, which is a catch-all category, and cybersecurity. So the reason I start with those, Shea, is that any one of those are multidisciplinary, right? What you do in ethics is different than what you do in cybersecurity, okay? So you can start with an area of expertise in any one of these areas. Excuse me. So start with some background knowledge. If you have no knowledge about those 5 areas, then you want to start there with even undergraduate level courses in philosophy, in law, in legal tech, in data science, in security systems, cybersecurity, data protection, building good systems. All of these are great and valuable background to plug into this ecosystem. Now, when you get into this concept of independent audit of AI systems, ForHumanity provides you with a perfect entry point. We have an area called ForHumanity University. It is designed to train people in how to do this work as an independent auditor. The courses are free. The knowledge is free. If you want to earn certificates to show potential employers or venture investors in your fund or in your company or your technology that you're building, the certificates can be earned. There's a small fee associated with sitting those exams. The entry point is Foundations of Independent Audit of AI Systems. It's this conversation, Shea, that you and I are having, but 12.5 hours deeper. The courses are online. They're asynchronous. People can take them when they want. I don't mind saying, Shea, that people have called me on a Friday, said, oh, now I know about that course. And they called me back on Monday, said, I finished the course. I binged watched you all weekend. I think they cheat and they do YouTube at 2x speed. So if you can just handle my voice sounding like, you know, a munchkin from The Wizard of Oz, then, you know, you can basically plow through a lot of this work. That is a great entry point. That will help you to understand this ecosystem and where you might like to be involved and plug into the ecosystem. After that, we can provide you can become a part of the community and we can help you. I'm a Sherpa and a guide to all who come into ForHumanity, and I will help you and the community will help you figure out where to go next. Do you want to go to risk management because you care about risk? Do you want to learn algorithm ethics because you want to sit on a standing and empowered ethics committee and engage in processes and procedures required under the ethics committee? Do you want to be a certified auditor in GDPR, Children's Code, New York City bias audit? The 2 we have coming up on Monday, we're doing disability inclusion and accessibility for the next 4 weeks. And then starting on March 6th, we do the EU AI Act, FHCA. So there are a lot of places that we can come. There are other resources as well. You've provided some great classes for people to get plugged into as well. And so I hope those are useful answers.
Yeah, that's excellent. Thank you. Well, thank you so much. I have to say, this is an exciting time for independent audit of AI systems. I think this will be 2023 is going to be the year that it kind of breaks into the mainstream. And I'm so glad that we've got people like you sort of at the helm trying to sort of guide us in the right direction, us meaning auditors, regulators, the public. And thank you so much for showing up. If you are listening to this on a podcast or watching on YouTube, we will have links to some of the things that we referenced in this conversation below. And, feel free to like and subscribe and come back and visit us again. Thank you, Ryan. Appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thanks, Shay, and thanks to all who came to listen.
Have a good day.